Hello, my name is Fisher Dardarian, and I am the Executive Director of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to The Future of Tonality, a conversation on Roger Scruton and music. Although Sir Roger is known as a conservative and intellectual of the highest order, and for many different things he did, including his work on architecture with the UK government, and understanding who Roger was and what it is he cared about, it's important to know that music was one of his first loves. In fact, I would say music is central to his philosophy and to his worldview. And as we seek to represent and explore Roger's legacy, I thought it was important that we did justice to this topic. And I'm pleased to say we have two speakers who will do just that. David Matthews is an English composer and one of the leading symphonists of our time. He has previously served as the music advisor to the English Chamber Orchestra, as the artistic director of the Deal Festival of Music, and as the composer in association to the Britten Symphonia. David has been the recipient of numerous BBC Proms commissions, including Cantiga, his dramatic 1988 scena for soprano and orchestra, and the Concerto and Azzurro for cellist Stephen Isaroulis, which was nominated for a 2003 BBC Radio 3 Listeners Award. David's written works include Michael Tippett's An Introductory Study and Britain. 2 years before he passed, Sir Roger had actually begun working with David on an opera titled Anna, a tragic love story set in Central Europe at the time of the 1989 revolutions. Stephen Johnson, our second speaker today, is a music broadcaster, writer, and composer. He is a regular presenter of Discovering Music on BBC Radio 3 and often broadcasts on BBC Radio 4 and World Service. He previously served as the chief music critic for The Scotsman and regularly writes for The Independent, The Guardian, BBC Music and Magazine, and Gramophone. Stephen has written a number of books, including Bruckner Remembered, Wagner, His Life and Music, and most recently, The Eighth, Mahler and the World in 1910. His music compositions include Behemoth Dances and Angel's Arc for clarinet and string quartet. And with that, I turn it over to you, Stephen and David, and look forward to all that you have to discuss today.
Excellent. I thought, David, we might start with reminiscing a little bit about, well, since we're both musicians and Roger played such an important part in our lives, I knew him certainly well, and you have known him for longer than me, and I think better than me as well. Maybe we could actually talk a little bit about how Roger came into our lives in the first place, because one feature of Roger that is, I think, hasn't been commented on a lot in the obituaries I've seen about him or in comments about him, was that he was an extraordinarily kind and generous person. In my case, he came into my life, as I gather he did with quite a lot of people, at a time when I really needed a bit of bucking up, because I was going through one of those phases where the BBC had decided that I was not quite what they required. And feeling a little bit like when Shostakovich was labeled a bourgeois formalist and an enemy of the people, and was wondering quite where my life went from there. And Roger invited me out to dinner with himself and another philosopher I'd met called Ray Tellis. And they then said, right, okay, well, this may feel bad, but this is an opportunity. Now you can start doing the sort of things you really ought to be doing. And here are a few suggestions. And it was marvelous, because I felt, as I knew him afterwards, there was this extraordinary avuncular kind of interest in what I was doing, and he invited me to join his discussion group, which we were both part of, David, at the Albany. I remember how important that was for me in formulating the ideas for the book I wrote about music and mental illness called How Shostakovich Changed My Mind. And being able to present to someone of Roger's stature and someone like you, David, and other philosophers and extraordinarily thoughtful people into those kind of extremely friendly conditions was something very important to me. And something else I think I learned at those sessions was that Roger was, in a way, the perfect Enlightenment host, because he was marvelous at getting people to respect each other's differences and listen to what they had to say, even when they disagreed strongly. And that's always been held up for me as a model, and how different that seems from the strident and incredibly polarized, in inverted commas, debate that we so often seem to hear these days.
Yes. I met Roger nearly 40 years ago at a party that he gave. It was after a promenade concert where Robin Holloway's second concerto for orchestra was played. He was a Cambridge friend of his. And I didn't really get to know him, though, till 1986, when he asked me if I could do a seminar in Brno as part of the underground university set up by the Jan Hus Foundation, which he was one of the organizers of this. And it had started with philosophy, and Roger had given seminars in Prague until he was actually chucked out of Czechoslovakia by the police, and he couldn't go back. But in Brno, the man who ran it was a wonderful theatre director called Petr Ozsley, and he wanted someone to come and talk about music, and especially Mahler, because he felt that Mahler, who was born obviously in Czechoslovakia, was very ignored. He thought quite possibly for anti-Semitic reasons in the Communist Party. Anyway, so I went out and I talked about Mahler's 10th Symphony and my own music, and this led to a quite extensive program over the next few years, where composers Judith Weir, Michael Barclay, others came out and gave seminars. And I got to know Roger much better through this. And he became really quite a close friend, mostly because of our passion for music. I mean, Roger was a very accomplished musician, and he could play the piano well. And we used to play piano duets together both in his flat in London. And when he moved down to Wiltshire, he had 2 pianos in his big study and in his library. And we used to play the Dvorak Slavonic dances a lot, and also the slow movement of Brahms's 2-piano sonata, which we played endlessly with great delight. But we were too lazy ever to learn the rest, because it's very difficult. We could manage. It's
not easy, is it? No, it's not easy. No,
we could manage that without practicing. And we found in music we agreed more or less. Exactly. In fact, Roger has written very kindly about my music, which he seemed to find fulfilled his ideas about the renewal of tonality, which we'll get on to.
Well, I remember one of the first questions he asked me was, "What do you think of David Matthews?" This is obviously an important barometer, I think, for whether I was acceptable or not.
So there we are, and I miss him immensely. I mean, he's such an ally and someone I respected in almost everything he did, but especially on music. And I think he was, as we'll come to this, he was a very important figure, I think, in talking about the future of music, and speculating about how it would go, but also encouraging people who, like me, wanted to try to return to tonality. And shall we talk about tonality?
Well, yes, it's one of the scariest concepts for anybody who's not a musician, isn't it? Tonality. People start talking about keys and things, and yet we're not talking about something really intellectual here or cerebral, are we? We're talking about something that I believe, if you feel it, you feel it in a very, well, visceral level, actually. I think it's a very important part of one's emotional response and one's shared emotional response to music, I think, isn't it?
Yes. Well, I think we first start off by saying that tonality is the language of music all over the world in various forms, not our particularly sophisticated form in other countries, in other parts of the world. But it is based on a hierarchy of notes or tones, as you said in the US, and it's based on scales, not necessarily the ones we use. I mean, Indian music uses scales, but they have what are called quarter tones in them. That's notes between the notes on the piano, but there's always a tonic, the most important note, the first note of the scale, and that's continually returned to. And there's usually, as in Indian music, for example, there is a bass, which is the basic tonality, which in Indian music persists all the time. Now, I think you could play a scale, couldn't you? To do it.
I could. If you'll just allow me to go over to my computer, I will play with scale. Hang on, I'll just have to take my microphone off. Here we go. Here's a scale of C major, classic scale of C major. That's C major. And coming back to C major, think of the classic Amen.
So
when you, yes, there you are.
You can hear the most important note in that scale is the first one, which is also the last one. There are 7 notes, and then the 8th one is the same. It's the same note as before, but an octave higher. And that's the major scale. There is also a minor scale, which is the major scale is thought to be, in a broad sense, happy, and the minor scale. Just play a minor scale.
I will indeed. Okay, hang on. Sorry, I'm now grappling with my microphone. There we are. This is the major scale. And this is the minor scale. And that makes the difference from... That is technically a dissonance for all sorts of acoustic reasons we can't go into here. But it tends to make that is a tenser sound than this.
Yes.
And that is one of the basic elements of tonal grammar, isn't it, in a way, I suppose?
It is.
Tonal semantics, yes.
And this is the language which was particularly important in the classical period, when, say, in the 18th and 19th centuries, when people were writing symphonies and so on, and writing them in keys, where you would start off in one key and you would move to others and then come back at the end to the home key. And this system persisted for a very long time. It got more and more sophisticated and incorporated more of what we call dissonances, which are notes which aren't necessarily in that scale, and chords which aren't necessarily in that scale. But we don't need to go into technicalities here. I think I think what we should say is that at the beginning of the last century, the 20th century, Schoenberg decided that tonality was exhausted, and therefore invented a system which didn't use tonality at all. In fact, it was called the 12-note system, and it used the 12 chromatic notes. You might as well play the 12 chromatic notes.
I will. Here we go.
If you don't just play the white notes in C major and play the black notes on the piano.
And technically, you shouldn't really go to the top one, should you?
12-note music, no, because that. And the idea was that all those notes should be equal, no one more important than the other. And you based your music on a tone row, which is a theme made up of those 12 notes, but without any repetitions. It's important that in Schoenberg that there aren't any repetitions, and also that the harmony should also be based on that 12-note row. I think here we get into difficulties for me, because it seems to me that you are rather limited in what you can do. But anyway, this system has prevailed. It was a very important change, and it led eventually to a further avant-garde after the war, which, while not using the 12-note system, used atonality as an absolutely fundamental principle. There was absolutely no reference to any tonality at all. Whereas in Schoenberg, you sometimes do get references to tonality.
Oh, you do. You can't help it in his music in a way. It's as though there's a part of him, an intensely nostalgic part of him, still wants to gravitate towards.
And he didn't give up the classical forms. I mean, he thought himself as the inheritor of the classical forms. So he wrote string quartets, and he thought of them as just an extension of what Mozart and Beethoven were doing. And melodies too were important to him. But the avant-garde after the war discarded, I'm thinking about Boulez and Stockhausen in particular, discarded any idea of harmony in the traditional sense, or melody in the traditional sense, or indeed rhythm actually in the traditional sense.
Yes.
It all went, and it became more and more just sound. And now there is a whole music based just on sound, which doesn't try to do anything that relates to the past. Now, this is something where Roger thought this was actually not the way to go for the future. And I think we both agree that if there is going to be a future in music, it should be a revival of tonality, but it can't, of course, be the tonality of the past. It has to be renewed in a way, and there have been various attempts at renewing it. Some of them very simple, like minimalism that you get in Steve Reich, say, or Philip Glass, yes. And this results in a music which is very easy to listen to, but it doesn't seem to go very far. I mean, it's not a match for the music of the past. And the same really with the music, although I admire it, of Arvo Pärt and Gorecki, who use also very, very simple tonality, trying to recapture the spirit of the Middle Ages in a way. But again, this seems to be limited in its expressive power. I think in order that music should recover its great strength, it has somehow to engage with the past properly. It has to take on board the past, but do something new. And Roger argued for this, although he was not entirely optimistic about what's happening at the moment. I mean, there are not many people who he thought were able to do well. In fact, he ends the Aesthetics of Music by saying that no one has actually managed to. His great book, The Aesthetics of Music, which you haven't read, it's the most marvelous compendium of everything there is to be said about music, including the whole idea of the philosophy of music. But it goes into great amount of technical detail. And he ends up by saying that the composers who've been trying to re-establish tonality haven't quite succeeded yet, but he's hoping that they eventually, some will. We'll see.
Well, that's a bit of an open question. I think one of Roger's big advantages, and as well as being a source of great personal suffering for him, was that he wasn't on the left. And most thinkers who are conditioned in the sort of broadly left liberal thinking in music are brought up with this idea of progress, aren't they?
Yes.
That there is this thing called historical progress, and that there's a right side of history and there's a wrong side of history. And through sheer force of personality, it often seems to me, and with a considerable backing of certain chosen German philosophers, Schoenberg was able to convince the world that he was the right side of history. But it looks less and less convincing now when you look at the number of people who are moved by and apparently respond to the kind of music that Schoenberg was advocating, and those who still respond to tonal music and to the kind of tonal music, including tonal music of pops and classical composers writing today. I think one of the greatest ironies was Schoenberg, when he invented the 12-note system that you were describing, is said to have remarked, "I've invented a system that will ensure the survival, the supremacy of German music for another 100 years. In fact, it did nothing of the sort. It's brought almost to an end the supremacy of German music, and brought the whole question of, it was the beginning of an era when I think Roger was able to see, wasn't he, that the avant-garde in music, certainly, however much it masqueraded as a politically progressive and particularly left-leaning kind of thinking, although Schoenberg certainly wasn't a left-leaning individual, was that it nevertheless really, what it did was preserved a lot of the old aristocratic ideals, that there was an elite that understood music and the mob's opinion was not worth having. And that this often sits very uncomfortably with Marxist or socialist ideals. And it's not surprising, isn't it, that quite a lot of the big revolutionary figures in the 20th century in music were not left-wing thinkers at all. And that actually, well, I think Roger had that ability to, because he didn't feel any kind of superego or any kind of compulsion to join in the sort of the determination to be on the right side of history. You know, you even see critics who clearly felt there was an example of a critic in England called Peter Hayworth, who more or less thought to himself, well, there has to be a progressive composer. You can probably tell that he's a great progressive composer because nobody understands him. He's got to be a German. And so it must be Stockhausen. And you can almost see that kind of Hegelian logic going on, who ticks the boxes, not who do I actually sit down and want to listen to. Yeah. And Roger, because he was so marvelously outside all that, had a marvelous ability to hone in and just see all the incredible weaknesses and doublethink and the self-contradictions of a lot of what's often considered to be the progressive point of view in music.
Yes, I mean, Roger was very, very active in criticizing Adorno, who is the chief figure really among these philosophers. And Adorno took up Schoenberg as his god, and also said that it was just not possible now to write tonality because all tonality was banal. And he very much criticized, having been invited to America, he then decided to pour scorn on all American popular music, including Gershwin and Cole Porter and Irving Berlin and so on, which he just said was rubbish this is corrupting the masses. I mean, it's not. I must say, it's not a very Marxist position because he wasn't really thinking about the masses.
I've often thought with Adorno that his, in inverted commas, pessimist Marxism fulfilled a kind of double function. On the one hand, the Marxism absolves his bourgeois bad conscience, whereas the pessimism absolves him from having anything to do with the masses and their ghastly culture, from which is how he would have considered it, because Adorno was a fearful snob. And the extraordinary intellectual convulsions he goes through to justify his snobbery in supposedly Marxist terms is a phenomenal achievement in a way. And that's not to say that I don't think that Adorno didn't also have brilliant insights, because I think he did. But we're all highly contradictory, and Roger was very good at recognizing, I think, both the strengths and the terrible weaknesses in a thinker like Adorno.
Yes, he had certain insights, but he also had incredibly ridiculous ideas in some ways. I mean, he said that Sibelius was a composer who was unable to write 4-part harmony. Well, someone who thought that, I just don't trust at all.
But then on another occasion he said, and this is the kind of thing that his followers don't quote, if Sibelius is admitted to the canon, then the supremacy of German music from Bach to Schoenberg is over. In other words, there's a deeply, deeply cultural supremacist idea, which is one reason why I think his ideas were popular to certain people in the post-World War, because it was a way almost of smuggling in that kind of thinking back through the back door, as it were. Yeah. And again, Roger had that ability to stand outside this, and because he wasn't part of the gang, he could. Yeah. He was like the child in the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. He could say, look, the Emperor's not wearing any clothes. And he would probably be, well, he was indeed roundly abused for this and scolded for it. But the fact is that what he said reverberated very uncomfortably and challengingly, and it still does.
Yes. He was very much a defender of the bourgeois, against the attacks on it by Marxists.
But he was also very good at recognizing the fact that the bourgeois, anti-bourgeois, is a very typical bourgeois position as well. Marxism itself is a bourgeois philosophy. It was, most of its champions were bourgeois, and
but then the bourgeois had to be destroyed and proceeded to destroy it, and carried on. But there we are. I just wanted to read something actually that Roger wrote about tonality, because I thought it was very relevant, really. He says, it is no accident, I believe, that the most successful pieces of atonal music have been operatic, dramatic, or vocal. Atonal music in the theatre expresses states of mind that are always partly negative. Every lyrical passage is shot through with anxiety. Every loving gesture is also a gesture of betrayal. There is no affirmation of life that does not mask a will to deny it. It is as though anxiety were programmed into this music and can never be wholly eliminated. Perhaps we should see atonality exactly in the way that tonality cannot be seen, namely as a style rather than a language. It is a style that reflects the epoch which gave birth to it, nihilistic yet saturated with romantic longing and nostalgie de la boue. Like every style, it was destined to exhaust itself, and the attempt to use it today is as likely to lead to cliche as any conscious return to tonality. Now, I think that's very sensible. And indeed, I mean, Schoenberg's saying that he could produce any kind of music with his 12-note system is just not true. All the music sounds anxious. It just has to.
Where do people encounter atonal music and actually understand it? You know, most people these days in horror films.
Yeah.
You know, think of some of the music for Bernard Herrmann's score for Psycho or for The Exorcist, and immediately, or you know, then you see where it's effective and where it actually seems to say something to a very large audience. But it is about exactly those characteristics that you've just described.
So we have to say, you know, do we really want to write? Is that the only music we want to hear today? Music which expresses incredible anxiety. I know we're all worried about the future of the world, and I think certain music expresses that fear very, very powerfully. But
well, of course, that was Adorno's point of view, wasn't it? That, you know, on one occasion he said, Schoenberg's inhuman coldness is superior to Berg's magnanimous warmth. I can remember having a lovely discussion with Roger about that one. And Roger pointing out that when Schoenberg was informed of this remark, he wasn't entirely pleased. And that Adorno was surprised that Schoenberg wasn't pleased for being praised for his inhuman coldness. But there you are.
Yes, there we are. So I mean, I would like to think that Roger will continue to be an influence on the way music is going. And if you read the Aesthetics of Music, you will see, you know, what he thinks, how music should revive itself. It's very clearly stated there, and in his other writings. Perhaps we should talk about opera, because and his own books about Wagner, because Wagner for him was extremely important, and he was very disgusted with the way in which people treat Wagner now, producers who try to diminish what Wagner's saying by trivializing it. He was endlessly saying this, and whereas he himself thought that Wagner's music contained certainly was a spiritual sort of music, which, although Wagner was not a believer in Christianity, the music itself has certain qualities which are common to religion. And he was quoting a lot. I can read out. He quoted quite a lot Wagner's statement that it is reserved to art to salvage the kernel of religion, in as much as the mythical images that religion would wish to be believed in. I'm running out of light. I think I'll start this again, because I need to put the light on to read this. As Wagner famously wrote, it is reserved to art to salvage the kernel of religion, inasmuch as the mythical images that religion would wish to be believed as true are apprehended in art for their symbolic value, and through ideal representation of those symbols, art reveals the concealed deep truth within them. I think that's very fair. I mean, that's very much what Wagner's music is about, and therefore those people who try to get rid of that element altogether, which I'm afraid is true of many producers of Wagner, particularly I think there have been terrible productions of The Ring that I've seen, are rightly to be criticized, I think. And I hope we will get back to taking Wagner seriously. I know there is this problem about Wagner's anti-Semitism and also the Nazis liking him, but it's not, I shouldn't, just because Hitler liked Wagner, it doesn't mean to say that we should diminish him.
It's a kind of have your cake and eat it attitude, isn't it? You know, if you really believe that there are these reprehensible things in Wagner, should you be performing it at all? It's kind of saying, you know, I'm performing it, but I don't believe in it, but I do believe in it. You know, it's a very curious position aesthetically and morally to take. You know, it's that I know Roger rather liked that saying of Martin Luther's, if you remember in Latin, pecca fortiter, which is basically, if you're going to sin, sin wholeheartedly. You know, it's a motto I've found very comforting on certain occasions. You know, that sinning with a bad conscience doesn't make it any less of a sin, so you might as well get something out of it. If you're going to do Wagner, you might as well engage what it is that Wagner is trying to say. And I'm talking with Roger, we both agreed it's very interesting sometimes to work out whether Wagner does believe, really, after all, that there is something transcendent in this, or whether it is just a kind of Feuerbachian belief in what human beings are capable of making themselves and projecting onto the heavens. And to use a kind of a very simple kind of neurological image, it's as though Wagner's left brain, his critical, rational brain, doesn't believe, but his right brain, his creative, imaginative, symbol-inclined brain does believe, and that is, after all, the bit that really directs when you write music. So when I listen to Parsifal, for instance, of which we just heard the prelude at the beginning, or other things of Wagner, I find it awakens very deep quasi-religious responses in me too, as the music of Bruckner or Bach or Beethoven does.
Yes, exactly the same here. I think I mean, if I were living in the Middle Ages, I would certainly be a believer. The fact that it's very, very difficult to believe nowadays doesn't mean to say that the ideas of religion have been surpassed. I think if you're a humanist, you can still hang on to these ideas. And you can still think of in terms of the sacred, which Roger was regarded as very important in art, throughout art.
And I think when we talk about tonality, for instance, in music, we are talking about something that was very much connected with his sense of the sacred. It was one of the ingredients of the sacred, wasn't it? It was one of the things that give us that sense of the numinous in music. I got that sense, certainly. Did you too?
Yes, very much. How are we doing for time? Are we?
I think we've got another 5 or 6 minutes left, and then we could. I think we've got a few questions already. So, yeah.
Good. Where do we go from here?
I think. Well, you were going to say something about Roger's own music as well, I think.
Oh,
Dave.
yes, of course.
I mean, he was a. I've only heard a little bit myself, but I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was surprised how remarkably good it was, how incredibly inventive and technically assured, and at the same time with much, much more than technical assurance about it.
Yes. Well, the trouble with Roger is, or I say the trouble, I mean, the trouble with Roger, I'll say, is that he wanted to do everything. I mean, he wrote novels. He wrote very good novels, actually. He wrote, of course, he was primarily a philosopher. He was also a lawyer. I mean, he qualified as a barrister. He was very interested in the law. Politics, of course, was a tremendous interest, and he said he spent half his life trying to convert the Conservative Party to his own views and failed. Which unfortunately is true. I mean, if you look at the Conservative Party now and its support for the arts, my God, no, we had a government that's had so little interest in the arts.
Well, I think I remember Roger saying in a talk some years ago that one of the reasons possibly why Marxism or socialism appeals to artists is that it actually gives them a role. It actually offers them some kind of significance and function in society, whereas the conservatism of the modern Conservative Party doesn't at all. It's, you know, they'll give Roger a tick for being a conservative philosophy, but as for showing any interest in what he actually wrote, I think that's, well, I don't see much evidence of that.
No. Anyway, I think if Roger had dedicated his whole life to composing, he would have become a considerable figure in composing. I think he had the ability to write. He had the ability to write melodies. I mean, I don't know whether you know that Lorca song about standing on the balcony. The boys.
Oh yes, I have heard that. Yes, yes.
And that has the most beautiful melody. I mean, I wrote a set of variations on it actually for his 75th birthday, and it's also I've actually quoted it in the opera that we were writing.
Oh, lovely tribute, lovely, yes.
But yes, he could do that, and he had. I mean, he had more technical knowledge of harmony and counterpoint probably than I do. but he didn't devote a great deal of time to it. I mean, he thought himself as an amateur. He did have lessons from me once. I gave him a few lessons, and he said he learned a great deal from me. I don't know whether he did. He always said that it was very important that I told him that his basses should move, and there were too many pedal points.
But those little bits of insight sometimes from somebody who could just, it's like Liszt looking over Wagner's shoulder at Lohengrin and saying, is there any music in this that's not in 4/4? And Wagner going, oh my God, and promptly writing Mein Herr und Gott for the king, in Act 1, which is in 3/4. And there are moments when somebody can do that for you, aren't there? I remember when I took a piece of mine 10 years ago to see the great Danish composer Per Nørgaard, and he looked at it and said, "There's lots good about this, but your rhythm, you've really got to do something about your rhythms. Listen to them, feel them, don't just think about them." And that was incredibly valuable piece of advice.
Oh, yeah.
But Roger wasn't a great learner. He was an amazing learner, wasn't he? I mean, he would learn things from everybody he talked to. I got the impression, he was always open to be instructed. He never came with a set idea about things. His openness to think was extraordinary.
Yes. So anyway, I mean, he did write 2 operas, and they were both staged, and I saw them both, and they both worked very well on the stage. I thought he got most things right. They were very much influenced by Britain and also by Janacek, I think. The first one was called The Minister, and he wrote the librettos for both the operas. The first one was called The Minister and was about a politician who forsakes love for power. And the second one, good theme.
Yes.
And the second one, Violet, was based on his friend Jessica Douglas Hume's biography of Violet Woodhouse, Violet Gordon Woodhouse, sorry. And this was an opera about this extraordinary harpsichordist, Violet Gordon Woodhouse, who lived with 4 men in the same house, some of whom at least were lovers. And this was also I think it was an advance on the first one, and it was more technically accomplished, and I think it worked very well. And this, I think, greatly helped him when he came to write a libretto for me in the last few years, in the last year before he died. And I found this libretto, which I've set now, extraordinarily good to set. I mean, he knew exactly what to do to create dramatic situations. And we have a lot of the old things of opera in, which you don't necessarily get often nowadays, duets and ensembles, trios, and the characterization, I think, that he encouraged in his writing of librettos, in the writing of this libretto, was very impressive. So it's just a great sadness that he'll never hear this opera that I've written, which will be dedicated to his memory.
It is a great shame. I also wish you were just mentioning there Britain and Janacek, and thinking how much I would have loved him to have written a book each about them as well. Yeah. Because with that practitioner's insight, he could, and the extraordinary background, he would have had the little nuggets that there are about both in his works are just fabulous. And you think there's a book in there, and if only he had done that. It's a great shame.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, but then he did die far too young, didn't he?
Oh yes, he did, and I think he always thought that he would get better. Though he did say, when I said my opera might not be done for 5 years, he said, "Oh, I don't think I shall last that long." And but he thought he was going to be in reprieve, I think, from this cancer, this dreadful cancer. And I only wish he had. I mean, he died not of the cancer so much as a chill. So he would have got to see his body was so.
Do you feel as a close friend that he was weakened by the shock and the horror of those latter-day controversies that he got caught up in.
Well, I think the New Statesman thing actually did do something. It was so cruel, and also completely false. I mean, luckily we have the tape of the interview, so we know exactly what he said, and it was distorted out of all proportion. The New Statesman did apologize. You talked about Roger's kindness, and indeed, he asked the editor of the New Statesman not to sack this man. When they did the interview.
Yes, constantly embodying the kind of Christianity that he talked about, more effectively than certain people who will bang their fist on the table and tell you that they certainly believe in God. He did talk about it extraordinary in the book on Parsifal, didn't he? About how he felt that one of the things the opera suggested was that it was possible to live a godly life, even if you didn't necessarily 100% subscribe to the idea of there being a transcendent deity. And there are things in his character that made me feel that actually he lived up to that. Actually, he certainly tried to.
I think so. Yes. Shall we invite questions now?
Yes, I think we should, shouldn't we? It is. Oh, it's getting up. Yes. So we've got some Q&As up here, I think. Björn Finker asks, can music be progressive? That would imply a telos. Is there an end in music? Is it happiness or beauty? I mean, this is the point about progress. People are talking about progress without often being very clear about what it's progressing towards.
Well, it's got to progress in some ways. I mean, it can't stay the same, but I think we should abandon the idea of progression as constantly inventing new sounds, because more or less all possible sounds have been invented. And we've also reached the point where, where we can't advance in that way. We can't write music more complex, I think, than some avant-garde scores, because otherwise it's impossible to play. But it has to progress. It has to reflect our feelings about life in the age we are living in, and that will change, obviously. Whether we can go on hoping that the world will survive. I've just written a symphony myself, which is about the idea of regeneration. If we can regenerate the earth, we may save the planet.
Well, of course, that was something else that Roger was extremely concerned about too, wasn't
he? Yes. He wrote a whole book, Green Philosophy, which is very, very good. So yes, and I don't see why happiness should be excluded from music. It's not the only thing. I mean, certainly, but to exclude it is to miss a whole part of what music can do. It can make us, it can exalt us by its mood of happiness. When you think of listening to Mozart and how happy that is, and how you're overjoyed listening to it. Your body feels. I've been listening to recently, reading Jan Swafford's wonderful biography of Mozart, which has just appeared, and listening to Murray Ferrier's performances of the piano concertos with the English Chamber Orchestra, and I just sort of sit there in ecstasies of joy at the happiness.
Yet at the same time, Roger was very good on how tragic music can help us.
Yes.
Uplifting too. That was something we had many discussions about. It was extremely important. Just notice here, Pavel Chetlinsky, I hope I've pronounced you correctly there, Pavel, asks, what about jazz? Do we know what, did Roger ever talk to you about jazz? I know that you and I are both very interested in jazz, but...
Yes. I never talked to him about jazz. I mean, I think he appreciated jazz. I don't know that he liked, he may have shared Philip Larkin's view about jazz, that the greatest jazz was in the 30s and 40s, and that some musicians now are self-indulgent, let's say. And also there is a sort of atonal jazz, isn't there now? But,
well, that's died out rather, I think. I do occasionally listen to the jazz programs and catch up. I have a niece who's very close, who's studying jazz at Trinity Laban, and the atonal jazz has almost disappeared, I think, actually, kind of.
Has it? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not really up with contemporary jazz. I mean, my favorite jazz is Duke Ellington, and I think that he would have agreed that Duke Ellington is a great composer. the great American composer. And that was that's the great thing that American music discovered was jazz, and used it. I mean, Gershwin was able to unite jazz and classical music in a most wonderful way.
I noticed a question here from Andrew Taylor, which I think, David, you read a quote from Roger about atonality, which ended with a comment about the risk of cliche in recovering tonality. Is it possible to recover?
Actually, it was about the risk of cliche in atonal music.
Ah, yes, yes, indeed.
That's what he was saying. I mean, cliche, yes, I mean, of course, Schoenberg went on about cliches. I mean, he couldn't use the diminished seventh chord because that was a cliche. In fact, Stravinsky used a diminished seventh in his violin concerto and made it sound completely new.
Yes.
I don't think anything is necessarily a cliche for all time. I think it can become cliche for other use, but then it can be reinvented.
Well, one thing I think that Roger hinted at, which certainly provided me with a lot of food for thought, was that because of Schoenberg, we've come to see Wagner's Tristan as the progressive opera amongst his operas, which is the one in which the harmony becomes most chromatic and ambiguous, and dissonance is emancipated to an extraordinary degree, and resolution is delayed for a very long time. But Wagner also wrote the Prelude to the Rheingold, which is nearly 5 minutes of just a chord of E flat. And you see in people like Sibelius and in Vaughan Williams and in Copland and Britten, this ability to rediscover something like a chord of C major and make it sound like a dazzling new discovery, as Vaughan Williams once said of Sibelius. So the fact is, it just takes an imagination with a fresh approach, and a cliche can be uncliched almost, can't it?
Yes, it can. Yes. So I think, you know, what we're saying is that music went for a long time in one particular path, and perhaps narrowing as it went. And now perhaps we can move on from there and do something which is broader in its scope, and broader in its language. Jazz, I think, is interesting to say. I mean, I've been influenced by jazz, I think, in my attitude to rhythm. And certainly some of my music is sort of rather jazzy. I've used the tango as well.
I know what you mean. I've certainly been influenced by it. I don't try to write music that sounds jazzy, but playing jazz with my niece, and particularly jazz that's where the rhythms are written out very precisely. And I, as a classical musician, of course, played them very precisely. And then she says to me, well, of course, you've got to unlearn that now. You've actually got to feel what they're about and play with them. And actually, that kind of dynamic attitude to rhythm has definitely left a mark on me. Yes.
Yes. Edward, my friend Edward Clark says, how would you describe the differences in the use of tonality we hear in your recent symphonies and that we hear in Mahler's 10th Symphony, which has so diligently been born out of the notes Mahler left behind? Yes, of course. I mean, Mahler's 10th Symphony was very important in my youth, and I've never sort of been able to escape from its world in a way, but I don't mind that. So when I write adagio movements, they tend to be a bit Mahlerian, but I hope they're not pastiche Mahler.
Well, not to my ears, but certainly no. I don't think
Shostakovich was also, you know, influenced by Mahler in that a way, but his music doesn't sound like Mahler. Britten was too, and I think you can be influenced by Mahler without. Well, all influences. I mean, gosh, I mean, if you don't have.
Well, there are passages in Mahler, aren't there, where he almost lifts something from another composer. You know, there's a great big lift from Fidelio in the beginning of the slow of his Fourth Symphony, but it sounds like Mahler. You know, I think, you know, people can be too afraid of not being original, can't they? And far too, you know, they might think, oh God, that sounds like Beethoven, I'd better change it in some way so that it doesn't sound like Beethoven anymore. But it's almost the pecca fortita thing again, isn't it? That if you sin wholeheartedly, people, and as Mahler did all the time, you can hear the opening of the Fourth Symphony without recognizing that it's a more or less straight lift from Beethoven, you know, and over again. In fact, it was years before I noticed it. So the originality, I think, is you either have it or you don't, really.
Oh yes, you don't have to. I think that if you try to be original, that's not the point. I mean, you're going to be original if you have something different to say. If you don't have something different to say, then you won't be original. But you don't have to worry about it, and well, you don't have to worry perhaps if you find that your music isn't original. But
or maybe you're not the best judge in the end as well. That's the other question.
No, you're not. I mean, people are always telling me who I've been influenced by, and I said, "Oh, really?" And yes, I mean, I've been influenced by loads of people, but then why not?
Yeah.
I mean,
I noticed that Petrusia Kowalski, asking on behalf of Boris Kowalski, asks, might atonality be most appropriate for the musical expression of the death of God and nihilism, as in Berg's Lulu? Berg is an interesting case, though, because Berg is always smuggling tonal harmonies back into his work, isn't he? And if you think about his most popular work, the Violin Concerto, probably, what happens when God is invoked? Bach goes straight back into B-flat major and quotes a Bach chorale. So it's when God is undead, as it were, in the Berg Violin Concerto, back we go to tonality. It's I don't remember Roger writing much about Berg. Did he ever talk about Berg with you? He must have done.
Well, I suppose we probably did at some point. Yes, I can't remember in particular things he said. But he did certainly think that Berg was, Berg's music in its incorporation of tonality in the 12-note music rather sort of, was much more pleasant to listen to than Schoenberg. And
the magnanimous warmth that Adorno considered inferior to Schoenberg's inhuman coldness. Yes,
he broke the rules, and of course he was free with Schoenberg's rules, and that's how he was able to work tonality back into Lulu, a lot of which sounds very tonal, really, and also very beautiful. I'm not sure that it's actually representative of nihilism. I mean, I would say there's I mean, as with all Berg's work, there's a great deal of feeling and compassion in it. I mean, he's very compassionate about poor Lulu. And think of the end of Lulu, which is a kind of hymn to Lulu. But I think that atonality is probably the most appropriate for death of God nihilism. But we don't perhaps if God has died, we might still be thinking about him in a non-nihilistic way. To put it rather clumsily.
It was something about. I remember reading that marvelous novel, The Life of Pi, recently, and I love the suggestion that there's a lot about faith in that book, and spoiler alert in a way, but the whole question about the tiger, whether or not the tiger existed, or whether or not it was a kind of fantasy that Pi came up to save his life. And you're left with the feeling that actually, well, maybe it was a story he told in order to survive. If so, it was a very good one. But then at the very end of the book, you're left with this possibility that there really was a tiger after all. And that's something that I do feel reading Roger on religion and on these crucial spiritual elements in music, that maybe there wasn't a tiger, maybe it's a story we need in order to tell ourselves in order to survive, or maybe it's actually real. And he doesn't feel the need. He doesn't feel the need to say there must be one or the other. I think one of the great things about him.
The baby is always there.
Yes.
And after all, we don't know. Well, I mean, the great question: why does the universe exist instead of not existing? We can't answer that question.
No.
I often think how extraordinary it is, and it gives me this sense of wonder. Leads me to not entirely give up the idea of possible existence of God, even though I think it's a bit unlikely. I mean, what's God doing? Did he give us the virus for punishment? It's strange. I can't go along.
Yeah, but the punishment for what? I think how you interpret it as a punishment for what depends on your point of view, doesn't it?
It couldn't go along with ideas that everything is willed by God. I mean, if everything is willed by God, that's a horrific idea.
It is rather, isn't it? And then you really are in very difficult places, aren't you? Yes.
Another question on jazz. No, actually, we have covered that, and American freeform, the dissolution of tonality, because we did say, freeform, all-night Coleman, etc. I don't know. don't know that he did. I don't know. I don't know. I've never read him about freeform jazz.
Oh, Roy Alves says that Berg's been a very important composer to him since 16, and he doesn't think that Berg is a nihilistic composer at all. I think quite a lot of people would agree with that. We both would, wouldn't we? Yes.
I agree. Yes, I do agree.
Yeah. Mm.
So,
Yeah. I think we've talked about Roger and that sense of the sacred that comes over so beautifully in his writings about Wagner in particularly.
yes.
And music was almost a form of religious experience, it seems to me, for Roger.
Yes.
I know he was very, very dubious about religious experiences, full stop. And I remember once mentioning something like that along those lines, and him actually shuddering in front of me. But that if there was a transcendent experience, an experience of the numinous that was open to human beings, nature may be, certain forms of art, but possibly music most of all for Roger. I get that impression.
Well, he said, I mean, he definitely said that music was the greatest achievement of Western art, of Western civilization.
Mm.
Just of civilization. He would regard probably Beethoven as the greatest man who ever lived, as I think I do.
I mean, I'm tempted to say that, definitely. I also remember an occasion when I think it's in one of his books where he says that Wagner was the most philosophical of the composers, as Nietzsche was the most musical of the philosophers. And in a way, in that sense, because I know Roger's feelings about Nietzsche were very mixed, but he hugely admired The Birth of Tragedy, which I do too. That in a way, Roger had the astonishing ability to combine both of those. He was, on the one hand, an incredibly musical philosopher, and on the other hand, would it turn out a remarkably philosophical composer? And that we might have seen more of that, as you said, David, if he hadn't been writing about so many subjects in so many forms. Yes. Oh, I know. Well, I think we're reaching more or less the end of our allotted time, aren't we?
I think we are, yes.
To see if there are any...
Most things that are important about Roger's attitudes to music, I think we've covered a lot of them anyway.
Other than to say that people wanting to read more about what Roger has to say, the three Wagner books, particularly the Tristan book, Death Devoted Heart, the book about the Ring, and the book about Parsifal. You mentioned the book of the Aesthetics of Music. That's not one of the easiest reads. I think actually a lot of Roger's ideas come across more accessibly in the Wagner books than they do perhaps in the Aesthetics.
There are also two very good books of essays.
Yes.
A lot of which cover, there's quite a lot of coverage of tonality in those, and the future of music, and individual composers whom he admired.
Yes.
And they're much easier reading. Yes, the Aesthetics of Music is worth persisting with, but it is a hard read.
I read it again recently, and I had to read it in chunks, definitely. But I ended up scribbling so many notes on the back pages of the books of sort of things I would want to quote at some stage that in the end I would want to read again. And the best short analysis of what sentimentality is that I can ever remember reading, actually, in the course of that book. Because so many people use the word sentimental without being clear as to what it is they mean by it. And this was a really good expose of what sentimentality might mean, I thought.
Yes.
Anyway, maybe at that point, a good point to hand back to Fisher. Yes. I hope we've sort of provided a few useful pointers in the course of this for people who want to find out more about Roger and music, and to remind people that he was a terrific writer. You know, a lot of philosophy is not good to read. But Roger definitely belongs up there with the readable philosophers, the Schopenhauers, the Nietzsches, the Kierkegaards, the Platos, up there. And there's a sense of playfulness and humor, of course, in his writing too, which is incredibly welcome, I think. You'd agree with me there, David?
Absolutely. Sure. Yes.
Well, very good. Well, thank you so much, David. Thank you, Stephen, for a wonderful discussion. I thought it was a great insight and view into Roger's work and his views and what we hope and I do believe will be his lasting legacy
Yeah, yeah.
in music. Um, uh, yeah, there's just much to be said there and many more thoughts. And I hope that we can continue these sorts of conversations, especially as it pertains to music, because like I mentioned earlier, and as both Stephen and David mentioned, it was a immensely important subject to Roger.
It was central. Central.
Absolutely. But again, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, David. And thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening or day, depending on where you are, and look forward to having you join us next time. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.